No opening intro music for this one because I'm not going to be doing any gaming for this stream. This stream, I want to talk to you a little bit about where the Lovecraftian Horror Pyramid is currently sitting and a little bit about where it might change going forwards. This, as you hopefully are very aware of by now, is the center point of my thesis for all intents and purposes. This is where I look at a whole lot of different Lovecraftian video games and I work out whether they are true Lovecraftian horror, they just have some of the aesthetic, they just have some of the horror, or if it's a game that has a mix of both, and then place it based on how distant the game, how far the game is removed from a definition of true Lovecraftian horror. So, over the weekend, as many of you would be aware, I played a bunch of different Lovecraftian games. I think I played 6 or 7 different games over that weekend. And so I now have a total of, I think it's 11 games. Yes, 11 games that I have now actually placed somewhere onto the Lovecraftian Horror Pyramid, which is a decent number. And I want to talk a little about what we've got going on here. But I also want to give a little bit of forewarning. So I am now a good 2 months into my thesis, and I have yet to receive any feedback from my supervisors, which has been one of the reasons why I didn't delve into doing an entire weekend of gaming before now, because I was really hoping to get that feedback, really hoping to get some clarification from them as to what their thoughts on what my criteria was, and if this approach was going to be particularly valuable, if there was a better way to do it. But I haven't got that yet, so unfortunately, it is very possible that everything that we are looking at here, including the pyramid itself, could be changed. It won't be scrapped, but it definitely could be changed. So where things currently are placed on the scale, things may shift over time, even if the bulk of it remains. And so I just wanted to talk about a couple of the changes I've made. First off, I removed the numbers that were on the side, and I've just made it 1 to 5, 6 to 10, and 11 to 20, just to make it a little bit easier for me to organize. And I've just put the actual number that the game is worth down here, and a little bit about the breakdown over here. So you can see that at the moment, the game that is leading the pack as the most as the most Lovecraftian game of all is Dagon, which is basically a audio visual version of the short story itself. I personally think it was a very well done game in a lot of different ways. But ultimately, you could actually question whether it counts as a game because it barely fits the definition of a visual novel. It's essentially a kinetic novel, or as somebody put it, an animated novel. And even then, it's barely even that because there's very limited animation. um, what was it? I think it was like audio visual a visual audio book. I think somebody reviewed it as one of the Steam reviews. Anyway, so it is currently leading the pack, and it had a lot of different elements. It had a sizable amount of Lovecraftian horror and a sizable amount of the aesthetic. But some other games have ended up much lower. Darkest Dungeon before was at the bottom of the Lovecraftian aesthetic. I decided it was cleaner to put, like, it only had 5 points. That hasn't changed, but I decided it was cleaner to have 1 to 5 in the bottom section and 6 to 10 in the top section rather than have 5 to 10 in the top section and 1 to 4 in the bottom section. That was just an organizational shift that shifted where it ended up. Meanwhile, No One Lives Under the Lighthouse, which was a game that I personally did not enjoy at all. Um, After reviewing its content, watching some Let's Plays, and just getting other, more not other perspectives, but delving a bit more into that without relying on my my gameplay skills or trying to bypass issues with the visuals and graphics, ultimately I decided that it counts as a 5 as well, and I placed it slightly above Darkest Dungeon. Having said that, similar to how Darkest Dungeon, one could argue, is more gothic horror than it is Lovecraftian, and that is the argument the developers put forward. They consider it a gothic horror. No One Lives Under the Lighthouse is often called a Lovecraftian style horror, but is much more akin to David Lynch, so Lynchian horror, in terms of the game's content. But at the same time, the developers don't seem to understand that themselves because they seem to think that it's a creepypasta. So No One Lives Under the Dungeon, Under the Lighthouse was an interesting one to actually try and review because there seem to be three competing interpretations of what this even counted as. But most importantly, we have a new bottom rank. Mythos Ever After, the Lovecraftian dating sim that seemed to lack anything Lovecraftian or even dating. Um, it managed to score 1 point out of 19 different points. And that is the fact that it happened to have references to Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep and a couple of other individual words that have just been transposed and had their context completely reinterpreted. It is at best a Cthulhu mythos inspired game, and it is a very, very loose inspiration at that. I'm not saying that I don't recommend the game. If you don't mind it not actually being what the game says it is, which is a dating sim, if you don't mind that, it was fun. It was genuinely fun, as opposed to No One Lives Under the Lighthouse, which I couldn't find fun. I can see why others would, but I just could not find it enjoyable. There were just too many gameplay issues, too many graphic issues, um, and just things like that. And as I was doing research for that one, I came across more issues. For example, the fact that the creators seemed to think like they were trying to make a kind of retro creepypasta game, but the retro period they were aiming for was the early 2000s, and what they actually got was the early 90s. So it really seems like the creators didn't even do their research for how to pitch the game, or they did, and they pitched it deliberately to tap into the creepypasta market and the nostalgia market, and they didn't really care that it was disjointed, that these things aren't the same as what they're actually saying. Um, I'm not going to outright say it was a bad game. Just because I didn't like it doesn't mean it was a bad game, and it has actually received generally positive reviews on Steam reviews. I am just going to say that I personally did not enjoy it, and I have tried to keep that out of my analysis, because at the end of the day, I am not measuring whether or not I enjoyed this game, I am measuring whether or not it is Lovecraftian. And the fact is that even though I would say that it is more Lynchian or creepypasta than it is Lovecraftian, it is still a much more Lovecraftian game than Mythos Ever After, which the secondary title is a Lovecraftian dating sim. So, this is essentially just what I wanted to cover off and discuss, the changes I've made to the pyramid, but also where everything is on here now. And I am looking at playing possibly House of Ashes later this afternoon. That's still a good 2 or 3 hours away. Hopefully less than 2 hours away, but we will see. And I just wanted to remind you that I still need to get the feedback on the first 15,000 words of my thesis from my supervisors, and that could change things here. It is entirely possible that my 19-point system, well, 19 and a bit, because I leave a little bit of leeway for other elements that I haven't yet considered or that are unique to this particular game. I'll talk about that in a moment, actually, in regards to Iron Lung. It is possible that this pyramid will change in the weeks to months going forward, depending on what my supervisors say. Now, I just wanted to actually cover off as well a little bit about Iron Lung, but also you'll see Cthulhu Saves the World and Dagon, they've got 0.5. In a 19-point system where I'm mostly working with whole points, the 0.5 probably looks a bit odd. And Iron Lung, you'll also notice, I got 5 points for aesthetic and 3 points for horror, which comes to 8, not to 9. But this is where I have a little bit of leeway that I like to work with, which is if the game has notable points that still make the game rather Lovecraftian despite not meeting the set criteria. And Iron Lung was the perfect example of that. So I want to talk about that a little bit, which is it only hits a few of the aesthetic and horror beats. And the reason for that is because especially with the horror side of things, it doesn't you get to experience the horror. You get the knowledge. It is known to you, the player. It is revealed to you. So all of these points, you don't quite directly engage with it. I mean, you do in a sense, but you engage with it in a way that isn't strictly Lovecraftian and doesn't really fit Lovecraftian horror. But the thing is that you don't actually, spoiler warning here, your character doesn't survive. The information that your character learns, that your character gathers, does not get passed on to anyone else. And it's really fascinating because it's a really good way to go. Iron Lung could be directly set into any Lovecraftian story. And if information had been left behind, if any of the records, if any of the photos had survived, if your character survived, they would have fulfilled a very specific role in Lovecraftian stories, and it would make this game very Lovecraftian because the shorthand there is that one of the things that Lovecraft does a lot of is he has a lot of exposition given by secondary characters who may or may not have witnessed the horror, but are at least closer to the horror than the protagonist. And you are essentially playing that subsidiary character in this game. But because you don't survive, none of that gets passed on. So the universe itself, the setting, still has a lot of unknown and a lot of indescribable horror and a lot of these different points that my thesis goes into. They're present in the setting, and if you stop and think about what the game means, it's present there, even though it's not actually kind of present in the gameplay itself. So that is why Iron Lung got an extra point. It's why Cthulhu Saves the World managed to get an extra 0.5, and also why Dagon managed to get an extra 0.5. They may not perfectly encapsulate one of the points that marks the criteria, but they lean strongly in those directions that you could go, I want to give it that point. I'm not, for whatever reason, but I want to give it that point. If I'm really getting that sort of a sense in the analysis, then chances are it's going to get a 0.5 or something like that. So that is why things are the way they are. That is why, if you really take a look at some of these numbers, they won't quite line up. And that is why you get things like No One Lives Under the Lighthouse being up here and Mythos Ever After being down here. So, or the forest being up here, or whatever, like the general placement of these things. So, that is essentially what I wanted to cover off. This image is probably going to get a little bit more organization as time goes on. For example, I'm probably going to have to add some extra lines in here specifically for the numbers to go into rather than how it currently is. But I figured I'd take the opportunity to explain these things now that I've had the chance to do an analysis of a decent number of games and really settle into what I'm doing and where I'm going with this. I cannot emphasize enough, though, that this all could change based on what my supervisors say, and I will have to engage with them about that. And who knows, maybe over time, as I keep playing more and more games, my perspective may shift in certain specific areas. And if that happens, I will go back over all of these points and essentially reanalyze all of the games all over again. So, as always, this is absolutely just another work in progress, but hopefully, as time goes on, you'll get a better idea of what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and you'll be able to use that information yourselves going forwards. At least until my thesis comes out, at which point you can read it and criticize me directly and tell me where you think I'm a genius and where you think I am absolutely stupid, or where you tell me I forgot to read it. Because, it happens. Theses are long. Some people will just read the cliff notes, and half the time that's all you kind of need to read, unless you're doing a full-on dissection of things like me. Anyway, that was it. I suppose I should wish you a happy whatever time it is for you, and I will get back to work. Farewell.